A father and daughter vanish while on a mountain hike, leaving a woman with many questions about what has happened to her family. But 10 years later, the mom receives a mysterious letter, and her life changes forever. As she climbed the well-worn path in the mountains, following in her father John's footsteps, Rebecca felt the chilly mountain air on her cheeks. Even though most teenagers would rather not spend time with their parents, Rebecca and John had made hiking a treasured tradition. Weekends were filled with her father's daring explorations into the outdoors, a trait he had always shown. These journeys were a refuge for Rebecca, a moment when she felt the most connected to him. As far as anybody could tell, their trek that weekend was completely routine. Always prepared with their sandwiches and sturdy footwear, they had headed out early. Rebecca was oblivious to the impending profound changes in her life. Sarah became really worried when they didn't come back by sunset. She was pleased to let her husband and daughter handle trekking as she had little interest in the sport. Their shared interest in the amount of time they spent together was something she loved. Thanks to John's desire to be so active, her family relationships were different from her own, which she enjoyed since she couldn't recall ever doing anything with her own father. Even more so, she enjoyed the security of her house and the company of her husband and children. She contacted the police, initiating a thorough search of the trails and neighboring towns. John and Rebecca remained elusive as days turned into weeks. After searching far and low and coming up empty, the authorities finally proclaimed them missing and believed dead. Sarah, nevertheless, did not give up hope, and instead devoted herself fully to finding answers. She could not believe her husband would allow his daughter to be hurt. In the event that a terrible fate had befallen them both, the question remained, where were their remains? How could two individuals simply disappear? There was no way she could accept the idea that she would never see them again. The thought was absurd. As a husband and parent, John had always done a fine job. Something terrible had to have transpired for them to decide not to come back. Sarah knew it. They were both well versed in the mountain routes, and John would risk anything for Rebecca's safety. She examined the picture, taken only a few weeks earlier, with interest. John and Rebecca were beaming as a picturesque mountain range appeared in the background. The picture crossed her fingers. She said in a low voice, "Where are you?" She couldn't help but cry. Although their marriage had been going through some hard patches as of late, she would give John her word that they got lost and made a wrong turn if it meant he could come in the door at this very moment. She took another look at the picture. "John, when was the last time you saw him so elated with her? Since when has their relationship become so tense?" Even before Rebecca's birth, John struggled in the early years of his company. However, suddenly, it was as if a puzzle piece had been missing. The company quickly became prosperous. After purchasing a home and planning their ideal wedding, Rebecca was born. When asked why he worked so hard, John would always say it was for his family, but they had been bickering more often lately. Due to his habit of working till late at night, he was always weary. In his little time at home, he kept to himself and had a melancholy expression on his face. He ignored Sarah's comments and said everything was okay, even though she begged him to talk to her. She had her suspicions, however. Rebecca had hoped that he would return home after his trip with a clear mind and be able to tell her what was hurting him, so she had encouraged him to go on the hike. However, he had now disappeared, taking their daughter with him. It was intentional, but she had no clue. John was so desperate that he decided to just vanish. His debt was piling up due to a string of bad investments. They were about to shut down since the company was bankrupt. In due time, all of his hard work will be for nothing. Even though Sarah worked hard, her pay wasn't enough to cover their expenses. A large property in a desirable area had been theirs to purchase when times were good, but now they just cannot make the monthly mortgage payments. Plus, ever since they were financially stable, Sarah had become used to a certain way of life. Now, she often went on lavish vacations and dined at five-star restaurants. How could he possibly advise her to forego all of that? Shame overwhelmed him. He had let his loved ones down. For fear that Sarah would abandon him for Rebecca, he withheld the whole scope of their financial difficulties from her. He devised a scheme to save himself from ever having to separate from his daughter, or accept that he had lost everything. In a moment of weakness, driven by his overwhelming love for her. On the day they disappeared, John had deliberately deceived Rebecca into thinking they had gotten lost, taking her off the beaten route. They spent days lost in the woods before finding a mountain town far away. The villagers' austere lifestyle and lack of contact with technology set the community apart from Rebecca's previous experiences. The adolescent first wondered why no one had located them, or when they would be returning home. Night after night she sobbed, hoping without hope that she would hear anything about her mom's whereabouts so she could escape the hamlet and join the modern world. Still, the time until then appeared to be slipping away. John supported his family by doing odd jobs and making up stories to explain their predicament. Something wasn't right, and Rebecca knew it. At one point, she would have told him he was mistaken without fear of repercussions, but now her father seemed to have transformed, and she was afraid to publicly challenge him. To this day, she has no idea where they were. John made it seem like he was concerned about her safety in the isolated place by forbidding her from leaving the house alone, even though she had no clue how to get home. She certainly made an effort. Still, she would slip away at the most inconvenient moments, either before her father left for work or when he would be sound asleep. Every day she ventured farther into the woods, expecting to encounter some sign of civilization or come across another nomadic hiker. Sadly, fortune was not on her side. Her resolve gave way to sadness with the passage of time. Everything she had known, her loved ones, her community, and her life, was gone. Over time, she ceased inquiring about John in any way. He pretended everything was okay, but she refused to speak to the guy who had suddenly and unexplainably shattered her life. Rebecca felt she had no other option than to attempt to adjust to their new lifestyle in the end. Either that, or she would have to spend each day alone in her room. She learned to fish from John. They grew their very own veggies. The day he brought home a few chicks and a coop, she was overjoyed. Life was almost perfect, except for the fact that their relationship had altered irrevocably. She could only put up with her father, but she knew she would always have feelings for him. They had a strong connection and mutual respect before, but it was gone. After some time had gone, Rebecca decided it was appropriate to resume her inquiries. Why did they never leave the town or even attempt to get in touch with her mom? She began to wonder. John became evasive and gave her evasive answers when she inquired about their lives before the accident, and if he missed it just as much as she did. Instinctively, she felt more worried. The reality, however, tormented her father, and he refused to face it. There had been a purpose for Rebecca's arrival in this community. On the other hand, John seemed to have persuaded himself of the tale he had been sharing with others. The reason for his actions remained a mystery to the little child. There was a lot of pain in Sarah's life at the same time. She was so determined to find Rebecca that she never stopped looking. She diligently pursued every clue, no matter how flimsy, throughout the years, using private detectives and combing through seemingly infinite trails. However, the burden of uncertainty was too much to bear. Their sudden departure further stressed her already troubled marriage, turning it into an intractable mystery. The company withheld all the documents from her until a private investigator uncovered them. A private investigator laid out the reason her spouse had seemed different before his disappearance. Nothing was going on. It was all over for him. He was about to declare bankruptcy. She went from being sad to angry. He should have informed her about this sooner. They may have been able to figure it out together. Sarah had a terrible suspicion that her husband's abduction wasn't coincidental. Had he truly abducted their kid and himself, the guy she had trusted and loved? Is he serious about hurting her in this way instead of admitting he needs help? It was as if she had completely lost track of John. Time went by, a decade. Now a lady in her 20s, Rebecca had not experienced the typical adolescent life. Her father's determination that they stay in the hamlet made her feel confined. Where would she go if she ran away? A notion that crossed her mind frequently. It seems that her devotion to her father was also a factor in her inaction. For the last decade, he had been her only companion. His perpetual uneasiness was palpable to her. The darkness in his eyes revealed a weight he was unable to share with her. Where was his true motive? Why was he still unable to tell her the truth after all this time? It seems as if life had other plans for her. But then, a terrible event occurred. John became sick, and he didn't have much time to recover. He went untreated, opting instead to attend the town doctor, since he refused to leave the community. With a quiver in his voice, he ordered his daughter to read the envelope after he left, and he delivered it to her one night as he lay in bed. Rebecca spent the whole night as her father went in and out of awareness. playing with the edges of the sealed envelope. She was eager to tear open the envelope and read the letter before she lost her opportunity to talk to her father, because she felt it held the answers to all the questions she had asked over the last decade. She finally slept off in the chair beside her father's bed, the unopened package on her lap, while she sank into a restless slumber. John had passed away the night before. Because of her father's death, her own feelings of emptiness and bewilderment, and her lack of clarity about her future steps, Rebecca sobbed hysterically. Despite her blurry eyesight, she tore open the letter and read it word for word. The letter laid out all the details. His writing detailed the decisions that brought them to the town, John's financial woes, and his terror of losing her. He purposefully led Rebecca to the most inaccessible place he could locate on the map, never intending to investigate the area further, in the hopes that it would evolve to the point where Rebecca would no longer be able to use any landmarks as markers. He hoped she would find peace and conveyed his sadness and affection for her. She read with a look of utter amazement on her face. For a decade, her father had kept this secret. He had convinced himself via a mental breakdown that he was about to lose both his family and his company. Part of her felt sympathy for her father, and part of her was furious. She had an unbreakable bond with him from the start, maybe even stronger than with her mother. On top of that, John had insisted they disappear for their last trip together because he was afraid she would leave him. He pleaded with her to contact her mother and supplied an address, their former home, at the end of the letter. Rebecca carefully traced the address with her fingertips. It had almost slipped her mind. Now, however, the house was crystal clear in her imagination. She could even see the expansive garden in her former bedroom. Still, would her mom still call that place home? Rebecca shook as she scribbled the address her father had given her. Little was revealed beyond her desire to reunite and the fact that she was alive. She ventured out of the cabin by herself and approached one of the locals to inquire about the process of sending the letter, her first move since reaching the community. They informed her that she could send the letter from the next hamlet, which she was unaware even existed, and provided her instructions there. The realization that civilization was just 3 hours distant from the hut where she had been imprisoned for 10 years caused Rebecca to cry when she arrived at the settlement. For this reason, John had kept her close at all times. Help and a route back to the contemporary world will be found by her, he knew. Although Rebecca was enraged with her father, she understood that she had no choice but to wait for another response, this time with the potential to alter the course of her life irrevocably. The words were muddled by Rebecca's tears when the letter finally came weeks later. It was her mother's arrival. She was ecstatic. When they hadn't seen each other in a decade, how could she start telling her everything? Reunion excitement and tremendous emotion greeted Sarah when she arrived at the community. Clinging to one another, mother and daughter wept and laughed together. Sarah was astounded by her daughter's poise and maturity, while Rebecca was astounded by the woman's kindness and power, qualities she hardly recalled. Rebecca let her mother in on every detail in the days that followed. Despite her horror at John's behavior, Sarah could not ignore the depth of his love for their daughter. Her suspicions had been growing ever since she found out about his economic troubles, and this only served to reinforce them. Anger, sadness, and an overwhelming sense of empathy for the guy she had loved all rushed through her as she tried to make sense of what had happened. Rebecca brought her mother the letter that John had written, and Sarah's wrath subsided as she read his words. She saw a guy whose terror had prevented him from communicating with her, a man whose desperation and love had driven him to make a horrific decision. Her heart ached for his survival. Everything she wanted to tell him had been on her mind. She would brag to him about how she was able to keep up with the mortgage payments after working more hours and getting a promotion. Not because she adored the posh area, but because she didn't want to leave in case they ever went back. She would have reassured him that the lavish vacations and expensive meals weren't important, and she would have stayed by his side while they worked through their problems. But by this point, it was too late. It was a joint decision between Sarah and Rebecca to go back home. It was not easy to adapt. Sarah battled to fill the void left by the years they had lost, while Rebecca felt alienated in a familiar environment. As they worked through their sadness and learned to forgive John for his mistakes, they sought therapy to help them manage their emotions and restore their relationship. They eventually settled into a new cadence. Sarah pushed Rebecca to follow her dreams and helped her get the education she had left behind when she vanished. As a result of Rebecca assuring Sarah of their future together, Sarah was able to recover happiness. Standing on the same mountain path where John and Rebecca had gone missing, Sarah and Rebecca were enjoying a bright day. It was a moving trek, and Rebecca had never been back before. Her mother's request that she come along had caught her off guard. As a means of paying tribute to the guy who had an impact on their lives, both positively and negatively, they had resolved to climb the path together. A grin spread over Rebecca's face as she glanced at her mother as they reached the peak. She continued saying, "We made it." As feelings of love and pride surged through Sarah, she nodded. "We did," she said. At that moment, the weight of the past seemed to lift. Forgiveness for John seems to accompany the rekindling of the mother-daughter link that had been lost over the years. They were determined to confront whatever challenges life threw their way as a unit.